Welcome to Exeter, one of the oldest and most historically riveting cities in Britain. Today the county town of Devon in southwest England, Exeter has more than 2,000 years of heritage under its belt. And on this walk around the city centre on a gorgeous summer's afternoon, we'll explore the city's history in depth, as we explore the ruins of a wealth of distinctive red-coloured medieval structures, take a walk along Exeter's bustling and architecturally varied high street, venture into the oldest public park in the country, take a look at the remains of the city's Roman and medieval built defensive walls, and even stroll down what's reputed to be the narrowest street in all of Britain. All of that is to come over the next half hour as we make our way around Exeter's historic city centre. But we begin our walk taking in a view of what is undoubtedly the city's most impressive landmark, the mighty Exeter Cathedral. Situated at the heart of the sprawling Cathedral Green, which is busy with people enjoying the sun, Exeter Cathedral is more than 600 years old as we see it today, although the history of religious worship on this site in Exeter actually goes back much further, in fact to well over 1,000 years ago. We'll explore the history of the cathedral's earliest origins in a moment, but when marvelling at the modern church, it's impossible to ignore the beauty of this part of the building, the west front, which as we get closer, you'll notice is made up of tens of intricately carved sculptures. Depicting everything from kings to prophets, angels and more, these sculptures rank as some of the most spectacular architectural features of any British cathedral, and they date from between 500 and 700 years ago, the statues situated higher up being slightly newer, works of the mid-15th century, and those lower down dating from the mid-14th. Altogether, these sculptures make up what's known as an image screen around the central doorway. Although interestingly, this iconic image screen wasn't ever part of the cathedral's original plans, only added for decorative purposes when the building was nearing the end of its nearly 300 years of construction. As we mentioned, the Exeter Cathedral that stands today is more than 600 years old, having been completed around the year 1400, but it took almost 3 centuries for the whole building to come together. Just around the corner from the spectacular west front, here we find the famous North Tower, one of 2 square towers flanking the cathedral, both of which date back nearly 900 years to the early 12th century, when the Normans decided to rebuild Exeter Cathedral on a grand scale. If you venture inside the cathedral, you'll be treated to a medieval interior possibly even more beautiful than the exterior that we're looking at here. But even on the outside of the building, there's plenty to discover, with this statue of the Exeter-born religious academic Richard Hooker standing as one of the main landmarks in what's known as the Cathedral Close. This open space in the middle of the modern city, though best known as the home of the medieval cathedral, can actually trace its history back much further, all the way to the Roman era in fact, when a Roman bathhouse and basilica, that being a large church, existed here. A couple of hundred years later, in the 7th century, the Roman site was taken over by a Saxon-era church, known as the Church of St. Mary Major, which served briefly as a cathedral in the 11th century, before it was superseded by the modern Exeter Cathedral. As the cathedral's status grew, the area surrounding it became enclosed by rows of houses, and for centuries this enclosed area, or the Cathedral Close, existed as the most significant religious site in Devon, home not just to the cathedral and the seat of the Bishop of Exeter, but also the historic Church of St. Mary Major, which stood alongside the cathedral for nearly 1,000 years before it was sadly demolished in 1971. Unfortunately, St. Mary Major was one of a number of historic Exeter landmarks that fell victim to sweeping post-war development in the city, Exeter having suffered heavily during the Blitz of the Second World War. Although in the corner of the Cathedral Close here, we find a collection of historic buildings which survived both the war and the ensuing redevelopment of the city. Here, for example, we're looking up at one of Exeter's most fetching Elizabethan-era houses, best known locally as Moll's Coffee House, which has been used through history as everything from a coffee house to a customs house, and which is also reputed to have been visited by a wealth of famous Elizabethan mariners, including Francis Drake and many more. But here, just beside the historic coffee house, we find the intriguing St Martin's Church, one of the city's oldest, smallest, and most unusual churches. Originally founded back in the year 1053, the red sandstone church that we see today was actually rebuilt in the 15th century, and it was crammed into this historic part of the city to serve as a parish church for an area of Exeter no bigger than a football pitch, where hundreds of workers and traders lived, just on the edge of the cathedral close. Narrow streets just like this packed tightly around the spacious cathedral close for centuries, as people began flocking to the medieval city of Exeter, which was fast rising to prominence as one of the main economic centres in the southwest of England. That's a status which the city retains to this day, but among the modern buildings there are many relics of Exeter's past to be found, including these, the intriguing ruins of St Catherine's Chapel and almshouses, which were originally built back in 1457 and designed to provide housing for 13 poor men. Here we can see the remains of what was a rather snug medieval chapel, but it's not just the ruins of the chapel and almshouses which have been found here. In fact, evidence of an older 13th century house, a 4th century Roman townhouse, and a 1st century Roman watchtower has all been discovered on this small plot of land, just a stone's throw away from Exeter Cathedral. Of course, given Exeter's lengthy history, pretty much every square foot of the city centre has been built on time and time again by successive dynasties and people groups over the last couple of thousand years. Everybody from Celtic tribes to Roman armies, Saxon settlers, Norman conquerors, and more. However, one constant through all that time has been the material with which buildings have been constructed here. A distinctive red sandstone which is still visible in a wealth of local landmarks, ranging from the ruins of St Catherine's there to the grand church of St Stephen just here. The reason for this is of course simple. Red sandstone, known as New Red Sandstone, is the dominant natural rock in this part of the country. Exeter and much of the surrounding area of Devon built on top of eye-catching red rock that was used through time to construct many local landmarks. And having walked underneath St Stephen's Bow there are few red buildings in Exeter quite as well preserved as St Stephen's Church here, which was originally built nearly 1,000 years ago in the 11th century, overlooking what is today Exeter's bustling High Street. Today the main thoroughfare of the city centre, the High Street passes by landmarks old and new on its path through the heart of Exeter, while also dotted with a number of statues and sculptures like this, the intriguing Riddle sculpture that was placed here back in 2005 and which is engraved with the words of 8 Old English riddles that were originally recorded in the medieval Exeter Book of the 10th century. So next time you're strolling down Exeter's High Street, take a closer look at the sculpture and try to solve one of the riddles yourself. Although that's far from the only hidden treasure of this city centre thoroughfare. As we continue along the High Street in this northeasterly direction, we're passing by a row of grand 20th century buildings that stand on the site once occupied by the historic Church of St Lawrence, which was sadly destroyed in 1942. During one of the worst bombing raids on Exeter in the Second World War. As you can imagine, the High Street was once lined by a wealth of centuries-old buildings, but it and many other parts of Exeter's city centre were devastated by a series of aerial attacks launched by the Luftwaffe during the war. The ruins of St Catherine's Chapel and almshouses that we saw a few moments ago were another victim of the vicious bombing that Exeter suffered, as thousands of houses were destroyed and hundreds of people were killed in no less than 19 air raids on the city carried out by the Luftwaffe, who targeted Exeter not for any military or strategic reason, but rather in an effort to destroy culturally and historically significant landmarks so as to destroy the morale of the British people. This was a campaign known as the Baedeker Blitz, which also targeted historic cities like Bath, Canterbury, York and Norwich, although Exeter was one of the worst affected, and after the worst raid on the city on the 4th of May 1942, one Luftwaffe bomber even boasted over the radio, "Exeter is the jewel of the West. We have destroyed that jewel, and we will return to finish the job." Fortunately, that was the last air raid on Exeter, and the Baedeker Blitz ultimately failed in its goals to destroy civilian morale. Although here we find the ruins of a historic structure that was destroyed long before the events of the Second World War. These are the last remains of Rougemont Castle, the medieval fortress that once stood over the city of Exeter. Originally built on the orders of William the Conqueror after his victory at the Battle of Hastings, this historic castle was also built of that distinctive red sandstone so common in Exeter, and that's why the castle is known as Rougemont Castle, that being the French for Red Hill. This structure, the former Norman gatehouse, now stands on the edge of the former castle grounds in a delightful city park, known as Rougemont Gardens, which skirts around the remains of old Roman-era walls, which the Normans used as a base to build their castle in the late 11th century. At the end of our walk, we'll get a closer look at Exeter's historic city walls, where we'll be able to see evidence of Roman, Norman, and later stonework all put together to make the mighty defences which once surrounded this historic city. Although, as we now make our way away from the castle and back down towards the high street, it's about time that we got to grips with the reason why so many different people groups have chosen Exeter here as a place of major settlement. Located a few miles upstream of the mouth of the River Exe, which flows out into the English Channel on Devon's south coast, Exeter has long been an ideal place of human settlement. And as we briefly mentioned earlier, there is evidence of native Celtic tribes having lived on the banks of the River Exe well over 2,000 years ago. However, it was the Romans who can arguably be credited with founding the city that we know today, which began life around the year 55 AD as a fort by the name of Isca. The Romans positioned their fort at the lowest crossing point of the River Exe, and for roughly 20 years, Isca here served as the base for the Roman legion known as Legio Secunda Augusta, a troop of roughly 5,000 soldiers who were responsible for maintaining control over this southwestern corner of Britannia. After just 20 years though, the Legion moved away from Isca to a new base in what is now the town of Caerleon near Newport in South Wales. But the foundations that they'd built here gave birth to a major civilian settlement. And over the course of the Romans' roughly 4 centuries of occupation, Isca, or Isca Dumnoniorum as it came to be named, was one of the liveliest and most strongly defended Roman settlements in Britannia, albeit far from the wealthiest, situated hundreds of miles from major settlements around London and in the north of England. Though the Romans did push further west across Devon and even into Cornwall, Isca was generally considered to be the edge of major Roman settlement in Britain. Although after the Romans withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, Exeter here fell into ruin, largely abandoned for a couple of hundred years before Saxon settlers arrived, who christened this place Escincasta. It's from the Old English Escincasta that we get the modern name Exeter, which literally means fort on the River Exe. And it was also through Saxon-era development that this city began to take the shape that we know today, with the high street here becoming the heart of trade, activity, and all daily life. Though this road had been regularly used as a major thoroughfare by both local tribes and even the Romans, it was in the medieval era that it really became the heart of a thriving city, with a network of alleyways and crowded narrow streets sprouting off the high street in all directions, while a succession of grand new buildings were constructed along the path of this bustling main road. Looming large above us here is a beautifully colourful house that was built back in the 1660s, likely as a townhouse for one of the city's many wealthy cloth merchants. Neighboured by a pair of equally fetching black and white houses, which likely date from the mid-16th century, this trio of historic buildings are some of the most eye-catching along Exeter's High Street, having survived the bombings of the Second World War, and having had their historic facades left in place when the period of post-war development swept along this main road. A walk along Exeter's High Street is probably one of the best ways to get an idea of just how much of an impact the Blitz had on the city, with the large number of modern mid-20th century buildings occupying the sites where historic houses once stood. Although there are also a number of older, pre-war houses which still remain in situ, having luckily escaped the bombings unscathed. As devastating as the air raids on Exeter were, however, they could have been worse. The cathedral survived despite suffering a direct hit from a bomb, while here on the much affected High Street, one of the city's oldest buildings of all remains largely unchanged from when it was built more than 500 years ago. This is the historic Exeter Guildhall, originally built in 1470, and today fronted by a beautiful facade that was added to the building in the late 16th century. Ever since it opened its doors, this building has been the heart of local government in Exeter, historically home to a courtroom, council meeting chambers, and even the city's stocks, which used to stand on the street just underneath the arches of the Guildhall's portico that stands so prominently on the High Street. And just a few steps along from the Guildhall, near the end of the High Street, there stands yet another of Exeter's many beautiful red sandstone churches, this one known as St Petrock's Church. Having undoubtedly been popular among the fads of the mid-1970s, the church actually takes its name from the Welsh-born saint Petrock, who is a common subject of idolatry across Devon. Petrock, who lived in the 6th century, was Prince of the Kingdom of Dumnonia, which encompassed modern-day Devon and Cornwall, while the current flag of Devon is also dedicated to St Petrock. This church in Exeter, meanwhile, is thought to have a history dating back to the 6th century as well, being dedicated to Petrock later on in history, although the current church that we see today is likely a little newer, probably built in the 11th century, just before the Normans arrived in England. Now, the Normans were responsible for the development of Exeter into one of England's great medieval cities, complete with an array of grand landmarks like the cathedral and the castle. But spurting off the High Street just here, we also find a rather more diminutive point of interest, Parliament Street, which is reputed to be the narrowest street in all of Britain. Measuring just 25 inches or 63 centimetres wide at its narrowest point, Parliament Street has existed since the 14th century, although once upon a time it was known by a different, slightly more logical name, Small Lane. Later renamed Parliament Street, likely in the early 19th century, this claustrophobic alleyway is often claimed to be the narrowest street in Britain, and possibly the whole world. But is that truly the case? Well, that depends. Exeter's Parliament Street definitely isn't the narrowest in the world, because that's the impossibly tight Speierhofstrasse in the German city of Reutlingen, which is just 12 inches wide. But as for the national crown, you could make a case to say that Parliament Street here is the narrowest in Britain. However, there is a competitor in the form of a tiny alleyway about 300 miles to the north of here, in the Yorkshire fishing village of Staithes, where an alley known as Dogloop measures just 18 inches wide at its narrowest, 7 less than Parliament Street. Having visited both Dogloop and Parliament Street myself, I can say that Staithes Dogloop is definitely narrower, but you could make the case that it is simply a gap between two houses rather than a street, which Parliament Street here in Exeter certainly is. Anyway, having made our way off the High Street via that narrow thoroughfare, we now find ourselves in the midst of the city's bustling Guildhall shopping centre, at the heart of which there stands yet another historic church, this being the Church of St Pancras. Once again built of that distinctive red sandstone, St Pancras' church here can trace its origins all the way back to the 11th century, although most of the building that we see today actually dates from the 13th century. Some suggest that this may even be the site of the oldest Christian worship in all of Exeter, But what's especially interesting about the church is that, after having been disused and left neglected for nearly 200 years, between 1658 and 1831, it was brought back to life. And even as the modern Guildhall shopping centre was built around it in the 1970s, the church remains open to worshippers to this day. The church is also one of a number of intriguing historical landmarks that have been cleverly repurposed as major features of this delightful shopping centre. Another one being the huge building that we're walking into here, the beautiful Higher Market. Now serving as the main entrance to the modern shopping centre, this covered market hall was originally opened all the way back in 1838, when it was built as a brand new venue for the trade of poultry, dairy products, fruit, vegetables, and more. The building of the Higher Market here, which followed shortly after the construction of the older, but now destroyed Lower Market nearby, was an important development in the modernisation of the 19th century city. Because beforehand, most of Exeter's markets were held in a rather more disorganised fashion out on the city's streets, as they had been for the best part of 700 years. In the early 20th century, as traditional city markets declined, part of the Higher Market here was converted into the new Exeter Civic Hall, a large events venue with capacity for an audience of more than 1,500, and which saw civic meetings, political speeches, musical performances and more from a wide variety of people over roughly 40 years of existence, before it closed in 1970 and found itself incorporated into the shopping centre that exists today. The shopping centre is a major draw for people to the heart of Exeter in the modern day. But just along Queen Street here, we can see one of the most popular museums among visitors to the city, the elegant Royal Albert Memorial Museum and Art Gallery, which was established back in 1868. The museum is housed inside this beautiful purpose-built building, which is one of the city's newest landmarks constructed of new red sandstone. And it plays host to a vast collection of items that not only detail the illustrious history of Exeter and the wider county of Devon, but also showcase captivating exhibitions on animals, international cultures and more. And the best part of all is that it's entirely free to visit, making a perfect spot for a rainy day out in Exeter. Of course, we've been really quite lucky with the weather today, and so we'll be passing by the museum for now and continuing along Queen Street to what was once upon a time the very northern edge of the city. Today, Exeter is a sprawling city home to more than 130,000 people, making it the second largest settlement in Devon after the maritime city of Plymouth, further to the southwest. And along with this historic city centre, Exeter now counts vast suburbs, a prestigious modern university and more as part of its cityscape. But once upon a time this was a walled city, which came to an end right about here, the site of the old Roman North Gate. The Romans first built rudimentary defences around the fort of Isca in the mid-1st century, but in the late 2nd century the civilian settlement of Isca Dumnoniorum expanded greatly in size. And so the Romans set about building a circuit of grand stone walls, which separated their settlement from the surrounding countryside. Here at the North Gate, that would mean that everything in front of us, including the grand Rougemont Hotel, was once upon a time located on the outskirts of Exeter, with the circuit of Roman walls coming to dictate the boundaries of the Saxon and Norman city that followed centuries later. In a few moments we'll get a glimpse of just one small part of Exeter's well-preserved defensive walls, more than 70% of which remain standing today. But here we're making our way into Northern Hay Gardens, which lay claim to quite a bold title, the oldest public open space in all of England. This historic park has been open to the public for more than 400 years, originally opened back in 1612 as a place for locals to stroll and relax, just on the outside of the historic city walls. Today, the gardens are one of the best places to see the walls up close, and just here we find a section of the historic fortifications made up of stonework from a number of different eras. the lower section of the wall being the remains of the Roman-built defences, and the upper section dating from the Norman era in the 11th century, when the historic walls were beefed up to provide protection to the newly built Rougemont Castle. Interestingly, a short distance along from here, you'll also find the only piece of city wall in all of England to retain Saxon-era stonework, demonstrating just how long and varied the history of Exeter's fortifications are. Most of the Roman-era wall was actually built using sandstone that was quarried from this very area of Exeter, now home to Northernhay Gardens. And this historic public park, despite being the oldest in England, has long had its fate closely intertwined with that of Exeter's historic city walls. As we encounter the iconic Exeter War Memorial, which stands in the heart of the gardens, it was back in 1642 that this park suffered the first setback of its lengthy history, as just 30 years after it opened, it was destroyed when the English Civil War broke out, and the city's parliamentarian defenders turned it into a huge ditch outside the walls, which served as an extra obstacle for royalist armies to overcome during their siege of the city. The parliamentarians successfully held off the royalist siege on that occasion, although upon the restoration of the monarchy in the 1660s, the Northernhay Gardens here were restored to their former glory, in the shadow of some of the most prominent features on the city's more than 1 mile long circuit of defensive walls. Here we find what's known as Athelstan's Tower, a distinctive feature of the city walls with a complicated history. It's named after the Anglo-Saxon king Athelstan, who built a castle in the 10th century where Rougemont Castle was later constructed, as part of his efforts to cement control over the West Country, after having driven native Celtic tribes out of Exeter and Devon into Cornwall. But despite the name, this tower wasn't actually built as part of Athelstan's castle. In fact, it was actually a work of the 12th century, serving as a defensive turret for the Norman-era Rougemont Castle, which was constructed on what is the highest point of land in all of Exeter, offering strategically valuable views over the city and the surrounding countryside. And while the tranquility of the beautiful Northernhay Gardens may suggest otherwise, over the centuries the city walls and defensive towers, like Athelstan's Tower, have played a vital role in keeping enemy assaults at bay. In fact, over the last 1500 years, Exeter has been subjected to no less than 6 major sieges, the most recent being 2 in the Civil War of the 17th century, won by each of the royalists and parliamentarians. Further back in history, a major siege of Exeter was launched by rebels during the Prayer Book Rebellion of 1549, an attack on Rougemont Castle was led by King Stephen during the Anarchy of the 12th century, while one of the most significant sieges in the city's history came in the year 1068, when William the Conqueror besieged Exeter, then a major holdout of Anglo-Saxon resistance against the new Norman rule, for more than 18 days, eventually taking the city and building Rougemont Castle. Even further back in time, Exeter was attacked by Vikings in the 9th century, who laid waste to much of the Saxon city, one of the reasons why there are relatively few major Saxon and earlier Roman landmarks to be found on the city's streets. That being said, there are few cities in England with quite the same variety of historic landmarks as Exeter, and even as we walk through Northernhay Gardens following the line of the city walls, you can go further by following the entire route of these historic defences around Exeter, which will lead you to a wealth of yet more fascinating sights in the city, including the remains of the medieval X-Bridge, more Roman stonework incorporated into the walls, and much more. Sadly, however, we won't quite have time to follow the entire circuit of defensive walls on our walk today, because it's here in the beautiful Northernhay Gardens that we're now coming to the end of our tour of the riveting city of Exeter. As we make our way through what is the oldest public space in England, we can think back to the wealth of captivating sights that we've passed by on our walk through Exeter. Everything from the mighty cathedral to the wide array of intriguing red churches, the remains of Rougemont Castle, and of course the narrow Parliament Street. But even as we've explored the history behind all of these and more, we've only just scratched the surface of Exeter's enthralling history. A history that's well worth exploring when you come to visit this city for yourself. But as we near the other end of Northern Hay Gardens, there are just a couple more things to point out. Just here, for example, we find a statue of one William Reginald Courtenay, the 11th Earl of Devon, which stands just out in front of another of the oldest sections of the city walls, which were incorporated into the defences of Rougemont Castle by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. While the walls continue on for a much greater distance around the whole city, the gardens from which much of their stone was quarried comes to an end just here, marked by yet another impressive sculpture, this one known as the Deer Stalker, which originally stood a short distance away from here on Bedford Circus, but which was later moved to stand as one of Northern Hay Gardens' many monuments. But as we take a close look at this dynamic sculpture, it's here that our walk around the riveting city of Exeter has finally reached its end. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to making your own visit to Exeter sometime in the near future.